Thank you, everyone, for joining today's October talk shop for the Society of Writers, Editors, and Translators. My name is Lynn Riggs, and I'm very happy to have these talks being continued as much as possible each month as part of SWET's regular activities to bring together professionals working with the English word in relation to Japan for information sharing and networking. Today, we're pleased to have with us Florentyna Leow, whose byline we frequently see in the Japan Times and elsewhere, and I believe, who I believe is especially fond of food writing, if I am correct, but with many hands in many fields. She is editorial director of the print publication Sankaku, about which we are going to learn more today. And Flory will be in conversation with Mike, who is a collaborator with the Sankaku project and a writer as well. He has recently published his first novel, Masquerade, which we will also hopefully learn about more today. Thank you very much, both of you, for joining us after we met you at the Writers' Salon in Kitakamakura last month, and enjoyed hearing about your really fascinating adventures with this new publication. And since this is a little different from some of the kinds of publications that many people in the SWET world have worked on, I really am looking forward to hearing about all the things that are new about this venture of yours. And I thought that Mike would be a very good person to talk to Flory and help us understand how it came about and what kinds of experiments and toils that you might have and all kinds of things about that. And I will not say more at this point and hand it over to you. Thank you very much. Go ahead, Mike.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Lynn, and thank you to Lynn, Lisa, and Bruce for making space for us today and last weekend as well. I'm really pleased to be here in conversation with Flory. I feel we've known each other for quite some time now through our mutual friends and through the Sankaku project. There's plenty of things I do know about the magazine and Flory's involvement, and there's many things that are still a mystery to me as well. And I feel like through our conversation, we can tease out some of those, all the nitty gritty that goes into the design and planning and production of an independent publication like Sankaku. So just diving right in, Flory, could you tell us a little bit about the sort of origin story of Sankaku, who started it, when it was founded, and like where, why, how, and so on?
Yeah, so I guess I'm going to be holding up books occasionally in front of the screen so people can see what I'm referring to. But Sankaku was, I think, the seed of the idea was born in pandemic 2020 between David and Sugai-san. They met through a mutual friend and they realized they had this interest in telling stories about traditional crafts or stories in Japan, specifically Tokyo at the time, that maybe weren't hewing to like more conventional cultural or tourism-led narratives. And because of the pandemic, we were all stuck in our respective cities, and they looked around them in Tokyo and saw a lot of opportunities and untold stories, as it were. So in their first issue, which is this one, it is now out of print, but maybe if there is ever enough money, we'll print it again one day. It is about craft in Tokyo, but focusing on more sort of contemporary projects. So for example, one of the main features in this book is about mechanical keyboards made entirely in Tokyo by Alvin, he's Asian American, isn't he? I realize I know Alvin, but I don't know his background. And the key thing was it's designed and also produced entirely in Tokyo. Previously, I think they might have been manufactured in China, but they decided to bring the supply chain to Tokyo because there's actually still a lot of small family-run factories. That was the thrust of the first issue, that actually production hasn't been outsourced everywhere. There's still a lot happening right within this giant metropolis. So Sankaku is very people-focused, and I think that's always been central to what David and Sugai wanted to do. So in the beginning, it was 4 people. David, Sugai were based in Tokyo, and Polly and Stanley. Polly does layout. Stanley does a bit of everything. He's like the final set of eyes on articles. He does design. He does sales. He plugs all the gaps that we sometimes are too busy to fill, which you need somebody like that in every organization. Polly and Stanley are David's high school friends. So that was how the first issue came about. Does that kind of answer the origin story question?
Yeah, absolutely. It's nice to hear about the pandemic background being the impetus for this, because I think it was such a intense moment for everybody worldwide, and the fact that for David and Sugai-san, it led to the creation of this magazine is really impressive, I think. I wanted to ask quickly too about the name. Could you tell us a little bit, to your understanding, like why Sankaku, why triangle?
Oh, absolutely. I think that there are two things behind it. One is Sankaku describes the relationships between us, the craftspeople, and the consumer, like with the 3 points on the triangle. You have the craftspeople, or people who we're interviewing, who are making the things, who are the subject of the stories that we're telling. You have the consumers, the readers, who might want to know more about the crafts or who are consuming the crafts, and then there's us in the middle, this relationship between consumer, manufacturer, and I guess middle person. There's also the idea that two people together might not necessarily come up with, they might just reflect each other. It's like a bit of an echo chamber where you throw a third person into the mix, almost invariably newer ideas might spark. That often happens, I think, with three of us in Tokyo, specifically because we meet up in person more of the time. And Polly and Stanley being in Canada, we do online meetings with everyone. But for example, David and I apparently I add an element of chaos to the group, and David's like our dad. Sorry, not David, Sugai-san's like our dad, just managing both of us sometimes. It's funny that way. So yeah, and the Sankaku, the logo itself, I'm gonna just share my screen really quickly. Little fun design Easter egg. You notice that the san is sans serif and the kaku is a serif font. It is like a really nerdy little design joke, but there you have it.
Wonderful. I love that. It's, yeah, straightforward, and also there's layers of meaning there that I really appreciate. So you told us a little bit about how the first issue came together between David, Sugai-san, and their collaborators in Canada. I know that you really got involved beginning with the second issue, right? And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about, yeah, how you came to be part of the Sankaku editorial team.
Yeah, I look back and I go, did I do that really? So I know David, I became Facebook friends with David way back in 2017 or 18, probably 2017, when he was still living in Ishinomaki and working for a furniture startup. Some of you might have heard of it. It was the furniture startup that came up after 2011, and it was one of those projects that was really revitalizing the area. So David was living and working up in the Miyagi for several years, and I went up there on the writers program for some time, met him there, became Facebook friends. A few years later, he moved to Tokyo. We met maybe once or twice, but didn't really become closer friends until the pandemic, when we got vaccinated together. This is a really long-winded kind of story, but how we got vaccinated together was, you remember when vaccination vouchers were being sent out to different wards at different rates, and we were all like eagerly waiting for them. And so these clinics started popping up. Like, we don't care if you have a voucher or not, come get vaccinated with us, but you have to sign up like really quickly. And one of these clinics popped up on Reddit, and my partners, sign us up. And so I did. And then I saw David online on Facebook Messenger, and I was like, oh, I don't know David, but he should get vaccinated. So I messaged him and said, hey, come get vaccinated. And so we'd all booked 3 slots together. We got jabbed, and then we went out for a drink afterwards. And that was how I got to know David a bit better. And after that, I think that was shortly before they were due to, maybe sometime before the first issue was being launched. And then they had the Center Sensations party. And he very casually mentioned, oh, by the way, our next issue is going to be on ramen. And I was like, ramen, this sounds very up my alley. My background's in food writing. At the time, I had finished my book manuscript, and I was itching for a sort of different creative project. And I was like, okay, I want in on this project. And so I basically badgered him until he was like, okay, why not?
I love that. Yeah, it's such an interesting, prelude to your involvement in this, but it makes perfect sense too. And all in the name of public health, connecting with David and joining the team. So you moved from craft in the first issue to ramen in the second issue, and the third one, I believe, is about religion or gods. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly.
How are these themes like decided, or it seems like a pretty wide scope
range
of things that Sankaku is really diving into. Is there an idea as to future issue themes that you all are already considering, or is it more of a organic, let's get through this one first and then see how we all feel and what's speaking?
I think it's very much more of the latter, and it's equally a mix of what can we do with the resources we have and the connections we have. The second issue certainly came about because they were looking for a subject that everyone had an opinion on and that everyone was inherently interested in. What can sell itself, essentially, because that was key. How can we build something that is sustainable? And so it was to be something people were interested in. So ramen was a really obvious choice, I think, that came up for them. And it's true, everybody does have an opinion about it. And there's been a real ramen boom in the last decade or so, but there's also a lot of stories that you can still tell, I think, about interesting angles that haven't necessarily been covered to death by English language media. With religion, I do believe it was because Japan has a lot of rich mythology. There's a lot of the long history, the interaction between Buddhism and Shintoism and folklore. That was something that I think there's a lot has been written about it, but there's a lot of contemporary stories that I thought we could focus on. And it was also a little bit of a joke between me and David. It took a while to convince Sugai-san that this was a good idea. You put the three together, it's like Tokyo Ramen Gods, which we just thought was really fun sounding. A lot of this comes out of, and I think that describes our ethos quite well. It's like about 60% serious and 40% goofing around.
I think it's great. You have to hold on to that sense of play, especially when you're doing something as intensive and long-ranging as this. You touched upon this a little bit when talking about ramen, but I guess I'm wondering, as we all know, living in Japan, in the past year to 2 years, there's been a real mushrooming of tourism here, a bit of problem with over-tourism in some cases. And I wonder, I think the first Sankaku issue came out in November 2022, right? And that's right at the beginning because the borders were opened here in October that year.
Yeah.
And so now 2 years later, things are looking and feeling quite different. I was wondering if this tourist boom has all impacted the way that you position yourselves as a magazine or the way that you're thinking about these stories. Because in the beginning, the sort of impetus to create the magazine was this idea that there were stories that were not as available readily in English about these different topics related to Japan, which is a place that many people around the world have a strong inclination towards, let's say, for one reason or another. So has this sort of recent tourism boom really shaped the way that you think about the magazine in some way?
I don't know if it shapes the way we think about the magazine, but it does loom like a little shadow in the back, right? Because I don't think we are producing it for tourists. We are producing this for people who are interested in Japan, and that doesn't necessarily mean tourism. But the tourism boom, it may have helped with, for example, sales at the bookstores at Tsutaya Tea Site in Tokyo and Kyoto, where we were stocked briefly. I think they've sold out. We do benefit from overall interest in Japan from like English language audiences, and a big proportion of that is inevitably going to be tourists. But I wouldn't say we cater directly to the tourism boom because we are very anti-clickbait and anti-stereotype, as it were. I think there's probably a very clear difference when you read tourism-oriented material as opposed to maybe the type of things we're trying to do. I find with a lot of tourism material, especially so much stuff sponsored by the JTA, for example, stuff we've worked on that is much more factual and rooted in what's going on, but more narratives of Japan rooted in some kind of traditional past. And I think it's a bit unfortunate that it is a lot to do with the commodification of culture, isn't it? To keep these cultures alive, like how we have to commodify them. And then to commodify them, that means putting them on show for tourists, which relies on, I think, keeping the image of that culture a certain way, but we want to show that's not necessarily the case. These traditions are living and evolving whether or not tourists are involved, although there is that consideration as well.
Yeah, definitely. I like the phrase anti-clickbait in general. I feel like that's a great ethos for the work that you do. Lynn actually asked a question in the chat that I think ties in pretty nicely to this. What is your perspective, reader? What kind of people do you think of as your main readers?
Nerds. In a very broad general sense, right? But the kind of people who read Atlas Obscura, the kind of people who read Gastro Obscura. Let me just type that in the chat, actually. I would love it. I would love it if Ed Yong ever read it one day. Ed Yong is ex-staff writer at The Atlantic, and he has done phenomenal work on the COVID-19 pandemic reporting, and He's a bit of an ornithologist. He's written about the natural world. That sort of very expansive, multidisciplinary approach. People who are, I think, are my ideal readers, certainly people who are curious about things, and not necessarily in Japan, but certainly in Japan as well. People who are curious and also have a sense of fun.
Great answer. And you mentioned kind of other publications, online publications like Atlas Obscura and Gastro Obscura. And in Japan too, I think there's like a pretty thriving magazine culture. I'm not sure what the state of it is these days with all the sort of pressures in the media industry generally, but in creating a magazine like Sankaku, I imagine that with a transnational team in particular, you all have your own individual and different inspirations when it comes to actual physical magazines that have spoken to you in your lives. I'm wondering if there's any in particular that you can talk about, whether the Sankaku team as a whole or you personally have been inspired by, whether it's a magazine that's Japanese based or from another part of the world.
Absolutely. So one big inspiration, I think, especially for David, but also all of us when we actually encountered it, there's one called Kokoku. It's an annual publication of essays from Hakodo, and they focus on a different issue each year. So not too dissimilar to how we do things right now. David's particular inspiration was their issue on logistics. Their book came in the form of an Amazon-style cardboard box that you had to open up to read, which I think is pretty cool when you're talking about logistics. And then so yeah, this is very much more on the design end of things. It's a magazine for designers, and it focuses on different techniques that to do with bookbinding, print, graphic design, paper, and each issue takes like a different physical form depending on its content. So that's also been very inspiring, I think, in trying to figure out, especially for the second issue, how do we make the book represent the contents as well. For me personally, because I focus much more on the writing side of things than the design side of things, I'm looking at publications like Fair. This is an issue I also wrote for and contributed to. This one is on Kyoto. They deal with a single city each issue, and I really liked their approach to things. They tend to reach out to writers. They don't take pictures. I stole the idea from including a glossary, which I thought was a really smart idea for each book, so that you don't have to keep defining it in the text. I thought that was really nice to incorporate. For the ramen issue specifically, there was Lucky Peach, which is now defunct, but everybody knows it, or at least everyone in the food writing world knows it. It was a real pioneer in food magazine and food design, food writing design. As for more contemporary zines, we've got the kind of independent publications that pop up in Asia, especially among our generation, which is really cool, and the younger generation. There's a particularly Gen Z one, which I think is very, like, a lot of fun to look through each issue. This is called The Slow Press. They are Singaporean-based zine collective, and they focus on food culture as well. There's Cheese Magazine, and they have a really beautiful design and interesting mixed articles as well. So all of these, like how these magazines approach food writing, is very inspiring for me personally.
Could you show that last one again? You're moving very fast.
Sorry, Cheese.
And this is very interesting. What's the title of it?
Cheese. It's Cheese Magazine.
I see it. Okay.
It is all about cheese. And you think like you couldn't fill up several issues, but you can. The piece I wrote for this one was about an Okinawan cheese called the Ryukyu Crown, and it uses the same koji you use for awamori. You have a very unique tasting cheese, nothing like nothing I've tasted before.
Very interesting. Thanks so much, Flore. I feel like, those are some really beautiful and eye-catching covers that you just shared too. I can see why Sankaku is also inspired by peers who are producing these kinds of works today. So we've talked quite a bit about like the background and ideating behind the magazine. I wanted to move into a little bit more about the nuts and bolts of it, right? And for a magazine like yours, each time when you're putting this together, there's a fair amount of writing and editing and textual work that goes into it. And I wanted to ask how you think of, or is there an ideal proportion that's written in-house versus commissioned? Because I know that's also different wildly from issue to issue. I believe David was the sole writer for the first one, right? And then second issue was one where you and I contributed as a writer and you were on board at the editorial team. How has that sort of evolved over time?
I think David wrote the entire first issue because there was no one else to write it in the team. I think at that point he was the only person writing in English. who was also based in Japan. So that was him. So for second issue, I did, because of my background in food writing, I knew people to reach out to, and I thought, okay, this story would be perfect for this person. And then David was also like, okay, let's get Mike to write, which was great as well. So our process is also looking around at our community. Who do we know we can work with and we trust, who we vibe with, and we can probably work together to produce a good story. It, as a very small publication with very limited budget, a lot of the budget comes from David and Sugai pooling their money and then revenue from past issues. It's difficult to take a chance, I think, on writers we don't know personally yet, or people who haven't come through referral, which is also why we haven't done open pitches or anything like that. And what else? Oh yes, at the start of the ramen issue, I think, we sat around brainstorming what kind of stories do we want to see, what angles haven't been covered in English. I think that was the main thing. What can we write about that hasn't been covered in English and that we have access to and that only we can do? A lot of ideas got cut because we couldn't access the right people. So for example, I really wanted to do a story on how limited edition convenience store ramen gets made, but we couldn't reach anyone in Ishin to do it. So that story got axed, which is a real shame. And the other determining factor is basically budget. Like, how much can we allocate to writers at a rate that is, if you think about the actual hours involved, like writing never adds up. But I think the minimum the least we've ever paid is like 15,000, which I still think is a bit more than Tokyo Weekender actually. At 15,000 to 20,000 an article. We don't have so we maybe for ramen issue we had 120 to 150,000, and I had to figure out how to allocate that between all the different writers. And for this issue, we had even less. I had maybe 100,000 as a budget. A lot of the reason for the low writing budget, I think, is because I'm on the team, and so whatever other writing needs to be done, I do it. So I think for volume 3, 60% of it is written by me. And also because the volume 3 is partially bilingual, so we had a much larger translation budget because it's also something that we have to outsource. We can't do it ourselves.
Yeah, it's quite a huge orchestration to be doing all that work. And I wanted to ask about the editing process in particular too, because with any publication of this scale and the number of different people who are involved, the number of cooks in the kitchen, there's going to be a fair amount of work doing, developmental editing to copy editing, proofreading and whatnot. I was wondering if you could just walk us through a little bit, like how has that process unfolded for Sankaku in the past issue or two?
I think process is a very generous word for it. I did ping David yesterday. I was like, hey, any input from you, anything you particularly want to note? And I think his notes on design and layout process, rhythm of general administration was, general administration is chaos. That's the nutshell. We do have bi-weekly meetings on Monday in the time zone that works for. So Monday mornings, Sunday evenings for Polly and Stanley in Canada. For the editing process, first things have to get written. And we try and work with the writers that we commission to give them long lead times. Because none of this is our full-time. Yes, we do have a Sankaku style sheet, actually. When the Stanley, I think, is the one who keeps everybody consistent with it, because I'm not always consistent myself, even though I created the style sheet. And real life often gets in the way. For example, one of our writers had a couple of deaths in the family earlier this year. So I was like, you know what, that deadline does not matter very much. We can extend that, just let it go. And as a consequence, we tend to end up with a lot of last minute layout editing. So it goes through several rounds of editing, I will say that. So one piece is written, like I'll do a line edit. David is often the one doing the structural edits. Like he has a really good eye for seeing how a piece can be, like the contents of a piece can be shifted around to suddenly make it flow a lot better. Whereas I'm a lot better at editing like the smaller details, like word choices or how a sentence is structured. So in that sense, we make a pretty good team on the editorial front. And the nice thing, it's both a good thing and a bad thing. All 5 of us on the core team are pretty anal in our own ways. So we all make up for each other's deficits in the editorial process. And whatever one of us misses, another person will usually catch. So, and Polly being design director, she often spots a lot of things in layout that we might have missed, for example. What else can I say about the editing process? Sugai-san does tend to do a check for how is going to read from an accuracy perspective as a Japanese person. And so he's caught several things like, oh, this is not really an accurate way of expressing this thing. And that's very useful for us to know as well, because as long as we've been in Japan, we are not from here. We don't have quite that same level of immersion. The editorial process basically keeps going until the book is pretty much published.
Yeah, it sounds like a very mutually supportive dynamic and one that stretches out over quite a period. So would you say it goes through the whole year from inception
Yes.
to pretty much execution, completion?
Yes. And to address Lynn's question, is there anything distinct about our style sheet compared to maybe conventional Japan-related periodicals? I can't speak, I guess it depends on which periodicals. I can't speak to that in great depth, but one thing I've been very insistent on is not italicizing words of foreign or of non-Japanese or of non-English origin. I think it is a slight othering of like other cultures and languages, and a lot of words from Japanese have already been adopted into the English language dictionaries, sushi, whatever. And I think it's a nice way of normalizing sort of integration with other cultures. What we do italicize are things like book titles, movies. And I think it helps also that we just include the glossary at the back. So if you want to look up a word you don't know, and if it's of Japanese origin, it is probably there. What else is there anything in particular that we emphasize? No, that's the biggest one I can think of. Oh, and we always try to include the line above, the macron above the O. So what is it? Hepburn style romanization.
Small touches, but I think they add up to definitely creating a certain feel for the magazine as a whole, right? You mentioned a bit earlier too that Sankaku is printed in Tokyo, which I think makes it quite unique in many ways. Could you tell us about your sort of experience finding and working with printers and any special anecdotes that relate to this production process? In particular, for those who aren't familiar, maybe you could share with us the ramen issue and everything that went into that beautiful slab of instant noodles affixed to the cover.
Okay.
Took a lot of work, and I feel always makes a nice story to tell.
So like I can't speak to the printing itself. I can speak to the sort of the bookbinding process. We work with a Tokyo-based bookbinders called Shinohara Shiko. I think they're a family run, probably about 70 years old, I think. I'm not entirely sure, but David and Sugai interviewed them as part of the first issue here. So we've been working with them, I guess, for 3 issues now. And how the ramen thing came about was we wanted to figure out a way to make the cover, the book itself, represent the contents. And I remember very early on in the beginning of 2023 saying to David, hey, we could make the book like an instant ramen packet where it comes in like a Ziploc and you tear it open and the nutritional content is like the names of the people we worked with and things like that. That was a nice idea. It didn't come to fruition because budget and design. But so they started experimenting with other things. I think the first iteration was clay noodles made out of clay, but that was super heavy and it just fell off. It would just fall off the book. Different kinds of paper clay, and that would have made shipping really expensive as well. Eventually, what happened was they eventually were like, why don't we just use actual noodles because they're light and they're cheap and they're the real thing. But then the question next becomes, okay, how do you put one on a book and not have it fall off, go bad? Then Sugai-san has a background in like engineering, and a lot of that I think is like material engineering, product engineering. He hit upon the idea of using vacuum forming. So if you go to a supermarket, there's plastic covering food and it comes in all sorts of shapes and sizes. Yeah, you basically heat up a sheet of plastic. And then when it's the right temperature, a force of vacuum just sucks it onto your mold, in this case, the ramen. And we did this all by hand because if we had to pay other people, if we had to hire the company to do it, it would cost a lot. So we spent 2 days in a factory out in Kotoku. Takes about an hour and a half from my place. That's near for David and Sugai because they live in East Tokyo. And we had this like big production setup. Let me just find the Instagram link for this because we have a couple of videos of how the process actually looks. Let's see. Yeah, it was a lot of. Sorry, go on.
Oh, I was just going to say the videos are pretty amazing because of the way that the covers ended up. It looks so nice and beautiful and almost, I want to say effortless, even though I know that there's so much effort that went into it. but it's such a nice product, but it's really cool to see the actual video of the ramen being affixed to the cover through that plastic process that you were just talking about.
It was like 2 days of going through 5 cases of ramen. And obviously we don't always get it right the first time. I can't tell you the brand name, unfortunately. They probably wouldn't be happy that we use their noodles without telling them. But yeah, we make it, and then there's QA. The plastic wasn't hot enough, so the ramen didn't adhere to the ramen properly, and it's not a nice shape. Or the plastic was too hot, so everything got stuck, and it just didn't work out. I think 2/3, we had to either discard or redo like 1/3 of all of them. I think we made 100 good ones in total, so there was like some more. But yeah, we didn't know. We were a bit worried that 2 days might not be enough at the rate we were going, but I think, yeah, eventually David and Sugai got the hang of it. We fell into this rhythm, I think, on the second day. So I'd be there, because I was no good at the plastic, the vacuum forming. So I'd be opening the packets and ferrying the noodle bricks over to the little machine and then ferrying the bits back. And then, of course, there's a lot of ramen bits that fall out of the packets. Tidy those up into a big bowl as well. I think David snacked on like a lot of them before he got sick of them. Like just straight up raw ramen from the packet. I have a photo of it somewhere.
Very nice. I think definitely was worth all the time and energy in creating this product. It's so cool to look at and such a conversation starter. I used to have one on my bookshelf that was like conveniently behind me on Zoom calls. And literally every time I talked to anybody, they'd be like, what is that? What is that ramen on that book behind you? So yeah, I know that. Okay, so I do want to talk to you about Sento Sensations, the sort of party that Sankaku has been throwing. But before we get to that, I wanted to ask about distribution networks. And you mentioned earlier that Sankaku had been stocked at Tsutaya in Tokyo and Kyoto, was it? Yeah, how have you thought about your distribution strategy within Japan and how have those relationships been formed with booksellers or other shops around the world? Where can people buy Sankaku besides online these days?
Let's see. So I think a few things to know. One, we don't have a big distributor, and part of that again comes down to cost, because I think we would have to sell it to them at a much lower price than we could just direct to the bookstores. The flip side of that is then we have to build those relationships with individual bookstores. I recall, I think, certainly for volume 1, I think the only place that's stocked it in Japan was Silo Saibin, which is a beautiful little design shop in Sasazuka. Silo Saibin. And it's also English language, so I think it's a bit of a hard sell in most Japanese bookstores anyway. But David and Sugai and me last year as well participate in a few art book fairs every year, usually Tokyo, Bangkok. And through that, you meet other independent booksellers who visit these book fairs to look for things to stock. You build up relationships with them, ask, hey, can we stock like a couple of copies at your shop? Oh, in the Philippines as well. We are stocked in the Philippines. David has built a really good relationship with a bookstore owner there who specializes in like really beautiful print designs. And I think he really likes our publication. So that's really nice. You can probably tell David is a de facto relationship building person in our team. Like the rest, all of us, we do sales to a certain extent. I get us stocked at Lit Books in Malaysia, which is one of my favorite bookstores. They have such a beautiful space, and the owner has great taste in books and is absolutely cantankerous about book talk. But yeah, David is definitely better at building relationships than all of us. Sugai-san is our Japanese-facing person, and he's the one who got us into T-Site, like pitching them and a few other independent bookstores in Tokyo. My connections tend to be more like food writing or food book related. Most recently, we were stocked in Books for Cooks in Melbourne, and that was thanks to a food writer on Instagram who brought me over to the bookstore and introduced me to the bookshop when I was in Melbourne recently. So a lot of these relationships are built on one-on-one meetings, because it's often hard to, I think anyway, convince independent booksellers to stock us in their very limited shop space unless they've seen the book and and understand, okay, this is actually something that people will pick up, because it's not a guaranteed seller, right? We don't have a huge network or a huge name at the moment. We're not Sally Rooney. Yeah, it's very much about convincing people one-on-one. But the other factor is we also just haven't been able to develop much of our resources to sales. So I think after volume 3, we might try and focus more on selling rather than production. Sankaku is not our full-time jobs, and I think all 3 of us in Tokyo, we're self-employed freelancers. Sankaku is like a 5th job for all of us.
I think it's a small but mighty team, and I think the sort of global footprint that you've already established in these past two issues, soon to be three, is already quite impressive. So it's nice to hear that through these individual connections and conversations, you're able to share this work widely in Southeast Asia and Australia and elsewhere. So that leads me into Sento Sensations, which is coming up in November again. For those of you who don't know, it's the annual Sankaku launch party. Coupled with, I guess it's more than a launch party. Maybe, Flora, you could explain it best. It's both a celebration of the magazine, but also there's lots of other activities that go into it. And it's held at a traditional Japanese bathhouse in Eastern Tokyo. How did this all come about? Could you tell us what goes into organizing the event? What other activities and people are invited to perform or participate? And what can we expect from Sento Sensations this year?
Okay, I can't speak to the first event because I wasn't involved, but my understanding is that it's the second event is fairly similar structure in terms of who was organizing it. David's friend Alan Dembski is a Canadian electronic musician based in Tokyo. And so it's like a collaboration between him and Sankaku. Last year's Sankaku launch party was also the launch of Dembski's new electronica single. And that was just a good way to tie both things together. The idea of holding it in a bathhouse, I don't remember why. It might be that they got to know the center owner, who is a bit eccentric but a really nice guy, and he's always really excited about Sento Sensations. He calls it his favorite event that they hold in Denki-yu. And Denki-yu, by the way, is the same bathhouse that was featured in Wim Wenders' Perfect Days, which some of you might have already seen. So let me just share my screen actually. So yeah, it's this lovely little space, and the neighbor Kyojima it's a pretty indie culture, like very community focused, full of people like artists doing cool things in the neighborhood. And the planning process, being involved with the third one at the moment, which is okay, we're winging it a little as we go, I think. But Alan Dembski is usually the one in charge of getting all the musicians. So we've got a couple of like DJs and musicians coming in from South Korea, Singapore. We had someone from Malaysia come in last year. So like people from all over Asia coming to play. There is a speaker sponsor. So the speakers this year are apparently even better than last year's speakers, which is nice. If you see this space over here, this space is where we hold the music, but also the panel talks, which were a new thing starting last year. Last year, we had a panel on creativity and community, as well as like art directing. This year, we have very exciting a panel on translation. We've got Polly Barton coming in. I'm so excited. And Leo Elizabeth Takada, who did the subtitles of Perfect Days. The second panel is about third spaces in Tokyo, featuring also the bathhouse owner himself. And you have everybody sitting on these little stools or on the floor, and the panel speakers are like sitting in the bathtub, which has been emptied of water, I hasten to add. It's really quite a vibe, not very many other parties I can think of. In the women's bath or the men's bath, there's an art exhibition space. In the changing rooms, we usually have where our books and other merch is stocked. And also little display alcoves in the lockers, where we displayed the bowls last year. That was neat. And we usually have beer, Jamaican food. Why Jamaican food? It was good. And this year we also have craft soda from Hong Kong being stocked here, which is neat. So yeah, that's what the space. And we also keep a foot bath open all day while the live music is going. And if you've never had a foot bath while a live DJ is playing, you are missing out.
Looks like it'll be another fun party. I've been to each edition so far, so I'm excited to get into the next one. It's November 23rd, right? Saturday.
Yep, that's right.
Maybe if you wouldn't mind dropping the link to that post that you just shared, because tickets are on sale already, or?
We are going to release the PTX page very soon. I believe there are I've written a text for everything, I think. There's always things happening, like ducks, right? Very serene on the surface, scrabbling under the surface, but we'll get there, we usually do.
Yes, amazing. So after completing such a big project and of course everything that goes into the planning and production of the Sento Sensations event itself, that's like a whole other set of things to think about and consider. How do you unwind as a team and celebrate the work that you've done and put together?
Given that right after Sento Sensations are the Tokyo Art Book Fairs, I don't think there's really been an established way to unwind/celebrate. But that's also because the unwinding and celebrating usually happens during. For example, the KL Art Book Fair. Yeah, you have a whole day of selling, and then we go we went out with the other people selling their zines to 12 people go to a Mamak store and eat our body weight food. So I think this, you can think of it as either a good or a bad thing, but we tend to mix work and play a lot, which I think helps keep this project sane and probably a bit more sustainable than it might otherwise be.
Absolutely. I think it's good to let off steam along the way. Otherwise, I'm sure it'll create some challenges for everybody. So I see in the chat that Alex and Bruce both have wanted to hear more about the third issue. I know you've alluded to and talked a little bit about religions, but can you tell us more about, what can we expect from the contents of the third Sankaku issue?
Absolutely. So for the third issue, it's, I guess, called Gods, but it's not really about any specific god. It's more about like the relationship between religion and culture today, or how people like see religion through their current life practice. And there are so many stories we could have featured. Like we could easily do 3 books on it if we had the resources and time. But one story, for example, is about temple stays in. So just find the link and link it to you. I don't know if anyone's familiar with the concept of Hirahaku, but you know how you can go and stay overnight in temples. And it's a fairly traditional kind of stay. Maybe you eat vegetarian food in the morning. Haku is a newer rebranding of that sort of thing. And particularly at Horinji, this temple up in Gunma, who's the monk we interviewed, who was actually David's friend from some time back. He started this terahaku as, it's, think of Airbnb for a temple. He basically converted his old family house into an Airbnb as a way for people to have a more welcoming space, a sort of more approachable space for encountering Buddhism, as it were. There's no real pressure, like you can choose to do the morning meditation or you don't, but like it's very much about getting away from the city and giving yourself time to either do some deep work, bring your family and your family dog and have a barbecue in the garden. Barbecue at a temple is a pretty neat concept. It's pretty chill, but it's also, I think, a way of making Buddhist space much more approachable than it might otherwise be to the average person. There we have a whole section of the book on Shimane. Shimane in Japanese mythology, it's famously the land of the gods, where the gods first landed in Japan, according to the Kojiki and all of that. We reached out to the Sign Tourism Organization this time, and this is our first time reaching out to a tourism organization for funding help. One comment we got on the last issue was that it was very Tokyo-centric, which I absolutely agree. A lot of that is what can we afford to fund article-wise, because like domestic travel can be quite costly. So after a lot of back and forth with the Science Tourism Organization, they very kindly agreed to fund our travels and lodging to Shimane for a week so that we could interview quite a few people about their work and what they do. And the big focus, and one of the reasons I wanted to do Shimane in the first place, was Iwami Kagura, and specifically Iwami Kagura mask making. I thought it was going to be a simple profile on Kobayashi Taizo. He's a young Iwami Kagura mask maker who has exhibited at the FCCJ. He does really incredible work. But it turned out to be a much larger story about the role his mask making plays in his town's community, and what the role of Iwami Kagura in that community in particular. And Iwami Kagura is a kind of folk dance that evolved out of Shinto ritualistic dance. This Minkan Kagura, yes. And it's something that people just do down in Shimane. They don't necessarily do it for the tourism, but it's very much a part of the community. And I think that's what made it such a fun story to research as well, because people really just did care about it for its own sake and not for putting on a show. And that was really beautiful to see in this day and age when it came to traditional culture. We have about Shojin Ryori. What else? We have an anime piece from a professor of cultural studies at Hosei University. That's a fun piece. A really sprawling conversation between Claire, who was on this call earlier, and Kirsty Bowers, who's a university friend from SOAS, where I did my undergraduate. She has, I think, two masters, one in religious studies, one in food anthropology, and it's like a perfect confluence of absolute nerdery for this conversation. In terms of religion, she has a lot of strong opinions about it. She's Dutch.
That all sounds really fabulous. Can't wait to read these pieces and check out the new issue. Do you have a cover that you can share, or is that under wraps for now?
It's still under wraps. Translation is still under design.
Got it. Thank you so much, Flori. I guess as we're wrapping up, I just wanted to ask what's next for Sankaku and what's next for you. This is an annual magazine, right? So I'm imagining you're already thinking towards issue 4, which will be out in 2025 fall. What else is on your radar?
That's a reasonable assumption, but the truth is that we don't know ourselves. The idea is that we might focus a bit more on sales after this because we've been so wrapped up in production for the last 2 years that we've barely devoted any time to sales or marketing. Like in very limited, we could do a lot more. And also the scope of our production gets larger and larger. Like this year's issue is partially bilingual. So there was the added factor, we had to factor in translation and finding translators to work with, and then figure out how that would line up with the English. And also we realized none of us are really Japanese language editors, except Sugai-san, but he doesn't like to think of himself as a writer. And then layout as well for a bilingual issue. That's been really tricky. That is proving really tricky at the moment. Even partially bilingual is a whole different ballgame. I don't know that we have necessarily a full volume lined up just yet. It's very much, I think we might have to take a bit of time out and really think about what do we do next. Maybe we do something smaller. Maybe we don't have such huge issues, but produce smaller, maybe more consistently, smaller scope that we can complete in reasonable timeframes on top of all our regular jobs. But yeah, I think the question David and I always come back to is how do we sustain this? So much of it is about where do we get the funds to do X, Y, Z. And I think that is a problem. That's the question that plagues every single indie publication out there, right? Who is funding this? How do we make this happen? And that's just the raw cost of doing things. Like we don't pay ourselves. Yeah, next up is sales and figuring out what we do next.
It sounds very exciting though, to be able to take a moment to take stock of all the hard work that your team has been doing over the past years and to think about how to introduce the magazine more widely to Japanese readers and also readers worldwide. Amazing. I guess we can transition into Q&A now. If anybody has something to ask, please feel free to unmute yourself or drop your question in the chat. I see Bruce also asked about advance orders for issue 3. Is there a place where we can pre-order the magazine?
Not yet. I think we probably don't want to release a pre-order link until we've actually sent it to print. Just because I think we like pre-orders, but we also want to have the product first.
That makes sense. I'm imagining the print is looming, right?
Oh, print deadline is looming. And in fact, the Cento Sensations this year is not really the official launch. I think we'll have advanced paperback copies. Like we'll have paperback copies ready, but I think we'll do a different official launch event next year. Will we get to grab it at the KL Art Book Fair? Probably. Paperbacks anyway. I think we should have ready by KL Art Book Fair.
I'll just pop in here again to suggest that maybe we can just continue to Q&A from participants, and you can drop out for a break if you wish. And thank you very much, Flori and Mike, for this very intense and information-packed hour, and encourage everyone to save the chat with all of its valuable links that we can review when we want to look more closely at all the things that were touched upon. And as a longtime editor and translator of periodicals, I am quite in awe of your energy and the breadth of your adventure, because what I call conventional Japan-related periodicals were not nearly as ambitious in terms of media and, what shall I say, fields of involvement, since most of them were pretty much really limited to writing and translating and editing. Whereas this is just a marvelous outreach to engineering and design, and so many. Design, of course, is part of all the conventional ones too, but design in a much broader sense, perhaps. And so that much wider spectrum of professional involvement is certainly extremely exciting and also time-consuming, I'm sure.
Thank you so
much.
But
the idea of continuing, this is something that Sweat itself, which had a periodical for 130 issues, entirely done on volunteer contributions. And I was the editor for large blocks of this history. I can imagine all of the networking and person-to-person cultivation that is required. And I really cheer you on in your efforts.
Thank
When
you,
we are
Lynn.
young, we can do it.
It's interesting. Like, I'm the only one who comes from a writing background, and there's only so much I can do with my networks. I think it's both a strength and a weakness that we all come from different professional backgrounds, and none of them are in publishing. So what people in publishing already know and probably are used to and can work around, we are having to learn from scratch. So if any of us had a background in publishing, we would have figured out that bilingual would present a lot more challenges than we thought, for example. But I think for all of us, it's been the most fun part of any of our activities. I know David and I were talking about how our regular work we call rice bowl work, which is just to pay the rent. But Sankaku is like the stuff where we're really learning and stretching what we can do.
Yeah, there is a huge amount of experience and professional know-how about periodical publishing in Japan, but it may be a good thing that you didn't tap into it because it might have limited the way you do it. And maybe it's deliberate, not tapping into those forms and things.
I'd like to say it was deliberate, but
because many SWET members are people who experienced most of the journals, magazines, and journals that related to Japan, like Japan Quarterly, PHP Intersect, a lot of the newspaper-related series and things. All of those have ended, and long ago, probably 2000. By 2010, most of the periodicals about Japan that specialized in articles of the nature that you're interested in had to end for financial reasons. And the era that SWET came into being was the era when those magazines were flourishing and were funded, and professionals could be paid salaries to write and translate for them. For many of us, it was always a shame that they had to end. But I'm getting a sense now that Sankaku may be a kind of pioneer in a return to interest and funding and professional involvement in that kind of publication, which is exciting. And I hope that you can keep it up.
Thank you. I hope we can keep it up. It's always a big question. How do we not burn out? How do we, we would like to be able to reach more people. And it's really about finding people who like us and want to work with us. I think we're not the type to try and chase after things that, or people that won't necessarily have an interest in us. Yeah, so fingers crossed. And I think the big one is if we can crack a New York bookstore, things might open a bit. The venues might open a bit more.
For example, Kyoto Journal is a real long laster in the field. And they originally had very generous funding from one philanthropist. I don't know how they're managing now, but they are continuing somehow. Big money seems to be.
This points to a much bigger question of funding across the arts generally, doesn't it? Often I feel like craft and books and art exist at the largesse of patrons. And it's a shame that fewer people want to be patrons these days.
People with a vision about culture. Anyway, let's hear if anyone had questions for our speaker.
I have a question. Mike, can you tell us about your book?
Yes, thank you, Flore. So I'm a writer, editor, and translator of Chinese to English, but my debut novel is coming out in the US at the end of this month. It's called Masquerade. I'll show, here we go. And really pleased to be published by Tin House in North America. And I will also have an online event that's mostly geared at North American time zones around the end of October. But for those of you who are in Japan and interested, I'm also having an event in Tokyo on November 9th, which is a Saturday. So I'll drop a link in here in the chat.
Great. Yeah, it's been very exciting to get all of these interesting related publications and things that we don't perhaps know about from our ordinary exposure here.
I guess while we're on the topic, I know Flore has also been involved in organizing a nonfiction event next month, which is 1 week before the Sento Sensations party. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about that and give us the link as
November is going to be such a literary month, I swear. So we've got Mike's launch on the 9th, and on the 16th, also Saturday after that. In fact, we had to coordinate dates so we wouldn't like clash. I don't have the link up yet, but actually, I'll just show you. The Tokyo link will be up soon, I think. Oh, actually, it's already up. Huh. Great. So Nonfiction for No Reason is a Seattle-based nonfiction reading event, and writers get together and read excerpts of their nonfiction specifically, because I think a lot of reading events focus on fiction or maybe poetry. The first Tokyo event was held in March. Katie, the founder, was coming to Japan on a holiday, and she thought, why not hold one in Tokyo? And so she miraculously made it happen with zero starting connections with anybody she knew in Japan. She just reached out and pulled the event together. And I was part of the event, as was Craig Maud, Yuki Tejima, and one of her writers. And I think afterwards, she thought about wanting to continue in Tokyo, but she doesn't live here. So Leo, Elizabeth Takara, and I are co-hosting this next one. And it's a smaller event this time. We'll have 4 readers, and we've got Karen Hill Anton, who is part of Sweat, I believe. And she's been a long-time writer in Japan. Polly Barton, who is currently doing a several-month stint in Japan working, and she'll be in Tokyo in November. We have Shibata Motoyuki, who is the, I think, founder of Monkey, the literary journal. Yeah. And we have 2 who Mike works with at the Japan Times. I don't know if I'm pronouncing names rightly. Sorry to. But yeah, so they're all really great writers, and in respective ways. I'm very excited to see what they'll read. So that's happening in Gakude Daigaku. And then, yeah, the 23rd of November, Sento Sensations. Polly's doing a couple of literary translation workshops in Waseda as well that month.
I might say that if you would like Sweat to advertise any of these events that might be of interest to people like us, that I can put announcements in our monthly bulletin.
Thank you very much. I think
which
yeah,
goes
I think
out. Yeah, it only goes out to the 200 or so members that we have, but word gets around, and
No,
so
I'm
we would be
sure.
happy to. If you let me know, I can put the information in the bulletin.
Thank you very much. I'm sure a lot of Sweat members would be really keen on coming to
Yes,
see
indeed.
Karen
Yeah.
as well.
And a lot of people don't see some of the notices that literary translators see, so it's good to have these other avenues. And we do have a Facebook page where our information also gets out to many more people. Yeah, I would be very happy to be able to share information of that kind.
Thank you.
Everyone, good to see your wonderful faces on this beautiful Saturday. I was managing babies. We got some successful diaper changes during this conversation. We got some snacks. We got a nap in. Things and I just wanted to, everything's been great. I love the whole conversation. I think it's been great. Lots of good info. Cool to hear about just how that publication is coming to life. But I also was reminded when Mike was talking about his book that he just got the new gig at the Japan Times, and I wanted to know if he was going to continue to write books for them, or what were you going to cover, and talk a bit about that. Congratulations on the new spot, man.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, so I have been working full-time at the Japan Times since early September, so I'm just a month and a half into it. I work between the lifestyle and culture desks, and I've written a few things. One piece I did last week was about Hong Kong's Nobel Prize, and in particular, this is a prize that she would not have won without her translators, really. And I feel that's an issue that I feel passionately about as a translator myself. The general visibility or lack thereof of translators in the publishing world sometimes. Besides that, I think I have a pretty broad remit, and we'll be working on other things related to film and more book coverage and so on. So I'm excited to continue that journey and be able to connect with different folks across the creative industries in Japan and elsewhere. And as mentioned earlier, Flori also is a regular contributor to Japan Times. She just had a piece about the Onigiri Summit earlier this year that came out a while ago, right?
That was really interesting. Yeah, that was great. Yeah. I'm a regular reader of the Japan Times, and I'm very keen to have more culture in there, more of the articles about books and crafts, and like the people that you're tapping for, the Sankaku, the people who are really devoted to their crafts and carrying them on. Looking forward to that. Anyone else? Question?
Yes. Going back to Sankaku for a moment, you said you're, what was the phrase, anti-clickbait. You have very little online presence. You're very print oriented. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Absolutely. I think one thing I failed to mention was that Sankaku actually started as a digital publication. Like all the articles in the first issue were actually available online first to start with. But I think the team very quickly realized that it was too easy to get lost in the flood of online content. And that conversely, there's actually more value in having a physical, tangible object. And at the same time, it is bringing it back to the book as a beautiful object rather than just a link you click on once and forget about again. Yeah, that was very, I think that was very much it. And from issue 2 onwards, and when I joined the team, I think there was a lingering sense of should we put some of the articles online? And I think at least 1 or 2 of us, I was very insistent that no, we keep it print only. There's no reason for us to have it online. 1, it won't help our sales, and 2, it would just defeat the purpose of it. Would just be contradictory when we're interviewing people who make physical things and then we make that story about them digital.
I thank you for that.
Yeah, just on the print and digital conversation, I think we're like experiencing a wave back towards print only. The T magazine that I contribute to, that's now in like its 12th issue, this is the newest one, it's called 80 Degrees. It's
80.
entirely online.
Oh, it's very pretty.
And yeah, it's beautifully done. He describes Martin, the founder, I believe he's Polish, but he's based in Portugal. He describes similar struggles with, is he going to make it to each issue? Is he going to make it to each issue? And then he makes each one happen. And this one's also at the Tsutaya and Daikinyama, like they carry a lot of their issues, but they try to make each one, something you want to keep, right? If you create a print publication that people enjoy the physical tangibility of, then not only is there no reason to have it online, but you'd lose the whole point of having it on your phone. And we're all like oversaturated with digital things. That's why I was saying, Sweat, bring back the publication, bring it back. I know that's probably too ambitious, but yeah, I'm into print. I'm biased, obviously, but I think that in these print only publications, however niche they seem, and however long tail, like the solution, like that ramen book could be like sold for 10, 15 years to ramen lovers who want it. So there's a smart reason to make it print only, I think, as well, from a sales perspective.
Maybe if we achieve Lucky Peach levels of notoriety. I think their first issue, they're a few $100 now. The first issue was their ramen issue.
I have one more Sankaku question, if you don't mind.
No, not
Tori.
at all.
About your readership. How would you describe them as nerds, I believe? But beyond that, what is the commonality outside of Japan what is the thread that brings it together? And
I think most of our readers are just curious and interested people, and people who I like to think that they're probably the type of people who are interested in various kinds of fields rather than just being pigeonholed into one thing that they do. Like I would certainly, at least I think that's the case anyway. Yeah.
But it makes it very hard to sell it, doesn't it? When it's such a vague concept as compared to somebody who wants to sell to fly fishermen or to ramen enthusiasts.
Oh, sorry. Also,
magazine.
People who are interested in craft, Japan and craft. That's the easy angle. Yeah.
Is it?
Ish. But I also think it varies volume by volume. So the first craft issue, we couldn't stock at Books for Cooks in Melbourne because it has nothing to do with food. But the ramen issue really, I think, in some ways capitalizes on that interest in Japanese food that people seem to have. And so Books for Cooks was like, we will take everything you have because it appealed to their target audience right away. And that's why I was a bit vague about it, because I think it will really depend on the subject matter each time as well.
Probably you will need to work on a definition of your journal. This is something Sweat has struggled with because we are so heterogeneous, but having something that defines you will help people to attach themselves to you.
Yeah, in general, our angle is we describe ourselves, I think, as a craft-focused publication, but I think the way that we define craft is not necessarily congruent with how people might think of Japan and craft. Like when we talk about craft, we're talking about the approach that people take to whatever it is they do. So in many ways, ramen is full of craftsmanship. It is a craft, but it is a dance. And so is a dance, which is a living art and which they work very hard at their craft. But then there's also the costumes, there's also the masks, all that involves craft. So I think in some ways, I also want to, through Sankaku, expand the definition of what people can think about when they think about craft.
There's quite a debate in Japan going on, especially now with the koge. I'm sure you're aware that folks who want to assert that koge is different from craft. And also the sort of unwillingness to use the word craft because they feel that it doesn't include art. And for example, there's the art of making artworks using craft technologies, right? And what to call that. And in English, probably craft is quite large. But I think in Japan, there's a lot of discussion about whether craft is really the word they want to use, right? And so I think it's very timely that you should be addressing that kind of topic.
Yeah, I will have to probably talk to the team about how they feel about it. But on a personal level, I think the approach that we take, which is to not hew necessarily to one definition or the other, but expand a more expansive approach for this.
You just have to show what you are.
Yeah, very much. And personally, I don't want to wade into that debate of koge versus craft versus thing.
It's not going to settle.
No, I'm sure it's not. But that's also what keeps it interesting, I think. That's also the problem with kanji, when you can use different kanji to define the word.
That reminds me of something that came to mind when you're talking. And now we're looking into a world in which it's much more multicultural and mingled, and where Japanese and Western and are not the only divides, and where our communities are so interlinked these days. We really want readers and writers to be able to write without borders, with consciousness of all the different cultures that are part of our lives, right? And when you are editing the text, you certainly come across situations where you want to edit a little differently so that it won't divide, right? Are you encountering that in your editing? The question of not using italics is very interesting. I can see that happening elsewhere, but there are other things as well. Maybe not easy to
find. Yeah, nothing concrete specifically leaps to mind, but there are certain choices that I make for that. So for example, I always edit out every instance of craftsman and replace it with craftsperson. Just very little things like that to keep things a bit more gender neutral. For every issue, we work with primarily women writers. Type world in Japan is dominated by men, but I don't think that should preclude us from trying to see who else is out there. What else? I think it was David who pointed this out. Oh yeah, we're an all Asian team. Yeah, Polly and Stanley are like Chinese and Taiwanese Canadian, Asian Canadian certainly. And then there's the rest of us. So we are not necessarily, we write in English, but we're not assuming that our audience is a Western audience.
No, it's wonderful, really, to have the wider perspective that's not confined.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's down to everyone's very different perspectives in the team, and that probably makes it a lot better and stronger than what it might otherwise be.
So when you're writing for this non-click audience and it's very abstruse, basically you're bringing to the content your own interests and things that you learn about. And so Tokyo is a great place to be at the crossroads of so many different crafts and arts and
yeah. I think, and the other thing
activity.
I think we try, and something I try to bring to it is, like you mentioned earlier, bringing in different professional backgrounds. I'm very much inspired by, there was a time in my life where I read a lot of Oliver Sacks, and he draws very deeply on so many different fields and strands, from mathematics to science to classical music. And that multidisciplinary approach is something I really appreciate, and I think is very interesting. We don't necessarily always succeed, but I try to bring those sorts of perspectives into how we come up with story ideas, or how we look for different angles in a particular topic. I think that helped, for example, with figuring out that I wanted to interview Yamazaki Naoko, the astronaut who ate space ramen in space.
Yeah, her article about eating ramen in space was interesting.
Yeah,
that's the kind of thing that we often read in the articles in the old days, when the editors were interested and connected with other fields, especially translated articles. We did a lot of very interesting things related to Japanese crafts that overlap where the content overlapped.
Are
But
there any-
unfortunately, most of those have disappeared.
No, I was wondering if there were
Yeah.
any in particular that you recall or that spring to mind.
The articles or the periodicals?
The articles that.
I'd have to go back. It's been a long time. Really, they have been out of print since the early 2000s.
Oh, wow.
So it's past history now. Certainly, you're opening up a new field, and you'll be definitely, if you can just stick with it for
Look into
five or
more
6
hands.
years or so, establish a reputation and keep your standards up, and money will probably accrue, I would think. But
the
it
whole-
does take a huge amount of commitment
Right.
from my experience. Yeah.
Yeah, this I always the thing I always say to David, this is a long-term game.
Yeah.
I think Craig probably took 10 years to get momentum with his things and just writing and publishing until he built up that reputation for himself. And I think this is generally the case with a lot of writing. It's a long game.
Yeah. Yeah. But your kokorozashi, your aspiration, hopefully that will buoy you up when things seem impossible. But if you have that theme, that purpose,
Mhm.
at least that's what keeps us going in Sweat, I think, is that we have this rather vague, indeed, purpose, which is defined differently by different people.
Mhm.
But it has had an incredible longevity without sort of putting too much pressure on it. I think
we'll do it as long as we continue having fun with it. I think is the really important
that
part
sounds
too.
like your basic line.
Yeah. Yeah.
I do hope you start taking subscriptions.
Yeah,
which would be
that's a good
financial
idea.
support for you. We were talking at the gathering last time about
Mhm.
subscribing to Substack
Mhm.
things, but that's the one
Yeah.
writer. Here you're providing a variety of content. I'll sign up in a moment anytime you.
Thank you.
I think you would get subscriptions now.
Absolutely.
Wow. I'll be sure to pitch that to David and Sugai.
And these days, you can do everything online. You can get them to pay online and update their addresses online and everything. So should be easier. And perhaps your access to writers and people who can proofread or edit or translate, perhaps that world can expand if you are heard about through Sweat and other organizations.
Honestly, that would be pretty amazing. I also know it's a lot to ask of people doing this on a volunteer basis.
So for now, it's volunteer. Yeah,
it's absolutely volunteer basis. We pay people for their for commissioned articles, illustrations, and translations. But the work we do regularly is entirely volunteer based, and yeah, it's a lot to ask of people. So we tend to let people approach us if they want to do it. Yeah. And also thank you everyone who's actually stayed on this long in the chat. I'm impressed.
Lori and Mike, thank you so much for your time today. This has been what's the word? I just say fascinating. That sounds too bland, but really seeing what all goes into it it's amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mike, for moderating and doing a fantastic job interviewing. I see Japan Times is absolutely paying off, or is it Japan Times is benefiting from you?
No, thank you all so much. This was a great way to kick off our weekends, a sunny Saturday. And thank you to Lynn and Lisa and Bruce again for having us, and Flori for all your insightful and thoughtful responses to the barrage of questions that came up with.
Yeah, no, thank you for the thoughtful questions.